This is a story about lobsters and the people involved in the fishery. That's the reason that it's a story of two species. Like most stories about complex natural and human systems, there are a multitude of ways the story could be told, each one as valid as every other. Every geographical part of the fishery has its own unique characteristics, and each fisher has their own unique experiences that have been influenced by when and where they fished, their economic circumstances, prevailing market conditions, and many other influences. This story has been informed by more than 40 people through face-to-face interviews. These were mostly people who had fished, but also may have been married to a fisher or involved in the industry through the supply of the goods and services it needs to operate. The people you will hear have come from nearly every South Australian lobster fishing port, from Port MacDonnell to Streaky Bay, and their experiences span the area between the Victorian border and the head of the Great Australian Bight. Collectively, these interviews cover more than 70 years of the fishery's history, but the story is also informed through records kept by one fisher going back more than 120 years, and others not so old. However, this story is by the very nature of the fishery incomplete. Nevertheless, it is hoped that it documents important aspects of the fishery and the stories of at least some of the people who have contributed to the history of one of South Australia's iconic industries. Lobster fishing in South Australia seems to have a particular significance in our communities, and the same is true of many other lobster fisheries. This is usually multifaceted and typically includes culture, cuisine, livelihoods, and local economies, and pride in what is generally considered a premium product regardless of the species around the world. Of course, which lobster tastes best, is most valuable, or is just generally the best lobster depends on where in the world you are producing or consuming them, and probably what culture you come from. But it certainly seems that lobsters hold a special place among all the different seafoods. Maybe it's their size or color that first captures a person's attention, or as I said, maybe it's their taste, or maybe it's their comparative scarcity. We know that scarce commodities often have high demand relative to supply, and therefore high prices, and this is certainly true for lobsters. Unfortunately, supply and demand has often produced a price that has contributed to overfishing in some places. But the South Australian fishery has done well in this respect, and we'll return to this topic later to explain why. We are first going to turn our attention to some of the most interesting aspects of the biology of Southern Rock Lobster before we turn back to the people involved in the fishery. Many Australians, a great number of Chinese, and some Japanese surely remember what Southern Rock Lobsters look and taste like, but beyond these simple characteristics, much about the species is still a mystery for many people, even including some of those who know the species well. If you ask any fisher about the species, you're likely to hear just how many questions remain. We know that our Southern Rock Lobster belongs to the genus Jasus. This genus is thought to have existed since the Miocene period, or about 20 million years ago. There are now 4 additional known species, all of which are found in the temperate seas around the southern hemisphere in a narrow latitudinal band. Our species became known to Western science as Jasus edwardsii, when it was given its scientific name in 1875. In Australia, Jasus edwardsii is distributed from around Cape Leeuwin in the southwest Western Australia to the southern New South Wales coast. This area spans more than 2,300 nautical miles measured along the edge of the continental shelf. Within this vast area of shelf waters, there are some areas where lobsters are more prolific than others, and these include parts of the southern zone in South Australia and southwestern and western Tasmania in particular. Traveling east to New Zealand, we would find more Jasus edwardsii. It is found along most of the North and South Island coasts, Stewart Island, and as far south as the uninhabited and subantarctic Snares, where it is the southernmost lobster population, as well as in the remote Chatham Islands, 800 kilometers east of the South Island. As in Australia, the New Zealand lobster fishery is managed by quotas. In fact, these were introduced before quotas were applied to our state-based lobster fisheries. If we continue further east, we would encounter Jasus caviorum, that is, if we went far enough east. This species is known from a single seamount, the Copernic seamount, found among the Foundation seamount chain more than 7,200 kilometers east of New Zealand. Lobsters were first discovered there in 1995 by New Zealand fisherman Joe Cave, after whom the species was named. Joe used maps based on satellite altimetry and gravity data produced by satellites as they orbit the Earth. These data could be used to predict the seamount's existence in a region for which no marine charts existed. This is because sea levels are slightly higher over the seamounts than the surrounding seas. Currently, the lobsters on the Copernic seamount are fished experimentally by the Cook Islands with a few management arrangements such as limits on the catch that can be taken on each trip there. The South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organization, responsible for fisheries management in the region, concluded that the small, isolated population would have developed over eons and would be incapable of sustaining heavy fishing pressure. Fortunately, there is some protection for the seamount's lobsters, although they are still vulnerable to fishing vessels flying flags of convenience that are not subject to the management organization's controls. Let's head further east. The next southern rock lobster to be found is Jasus frontalis. This species is only found around the Juan Fernandez archipelago and Desventuradas Islands, more than 650 kilometers off the coast of Chile. Juan Fernandez and Selkirk Island are perhaps best known as the place Alexander Selkirk was cast away in 1704 to 1709, and whose story is thought to have been the inspiration for the character of Robinson Crusoe. Here, a small-scale fishery that produced just 75 tons of lobsters in 2020 is carried out by fishers living in the Juan Fernandez archipelago. The fishery is their main source of income and, as might be inferred from what you're about to see, it is also an important part of the local community's culture. Unlike fishermen here, islanders must catch their lobster bait themselves, one step at a time. Though not shown here, they begin by jig fishing for small bait fish, use these to catch larger scalefish, and finally, use the scalefish to catch moray eels that become the lobster's bait. This footage, captured by Charles Acevedo, records some of the fishing at the rugged, remote, and spectacular Selkirk Island, about 170 kilometers west of Robinson Crusoe Island, during the 2020-21 season. Fishermen are transported to their fishing camp here for the season by a larger vessel. You'll recognize that many of the activities being undertaken are like those you might see in our fishery, while others are starkly different. The spirit in which the fishing is undertaken is inspiring. Continuing east around the southern tip of South America, we would reach Tristan da Cunha in the central South Atlantic, where Jasus paulensis is found. Until recently, lobsters at Tristan da Cunha were treated as a separate species named Jasus tristani. Jasus paulensis is the only species in the genus Jasus that is found across two oceans, as it is also found at St. Paul Island, after which it was named, and the nearby New Amsterdam Island in the southern Indian Ocean. about 7,500 kilometers east of Tristan da Cunha and 3,500 kilometers southwest of Perth. We'll come back to St. Paul shortly. Tristan da Cunha is the home of one of the most isolated communities on Earth. It is a 6-day voyage on a freighter from Cape Town to get there, and that is generally the only way to get there. The community has 235 residents who are largely self-sufficient through farming and fishing. The island's largest source of revenue is the lobster fishery. 12 dories are licensed to fish for lobster normally with crews of 2. They catch the 120-ton quota around their home island, but fishing around other nearby islands is undertaken by a factory vessel from Cape Town. Total production is about 440 tons. Islanders argue that sustainable fishing is the key to their community maintaining its economic independence and no doubt their sense of self. Jasus lelandii is our next species. It lives mostly along the western coastlines of South Africa and in Namibia. The fishery in South Africa alone produced catches of between 13,000 and 16,000 tons in the 1950s and 60s, making it by far the largest fishery for any southern rock lobster species. Unfortunately, this is one lobster species that has suffered a catastrophic collapse.
Rock lobster is now a red-listed species.
Absolutely, John, and it's rather unfortunate assessment throws it smack bang in the very red category. And what that means is please, please don't buy it, don't eat it, don't dry it, don't catch it, because it's in serious, serious trouble. There's some really critical conservation concerns around the species. And not just the species. I mean, a lot of rock lobster is caught by what we call small-scale fishers. So their livelihoods are also in trouble.
These fishing communities are in dire straits. They're grieving because their fishery is in serious decline. They're grieving because of all the social ills connected to this, but the fishery is part of who they are.
What happened with West Coast rock lobster is much of the damage was actually done 50 years ago. It was very heavy commercial exploitation in the 50s and 60s. That's what pulled the population way down. We've been down to just a few percent of the abundance that we had historically. While we've been trying to get the population up from this 2%, in the last couple of decades, the poaching component has got virtually out of control.
And the issue is in this particular fishery that not only goes into an opaque, undocumented market, a lot of that product actually ends up in formal markets, the product being exported out of South Africa that's illegal, but through a formal channel.
I believe the indigenous knowledge of the fishes, that's what guides you. And for a lobster to grow to an adult, it's a lot of years. For my experience, it's 21 years for a small lobster to grow. Okay. Size. Put it in a... First and foremost, no matter if it's size or not, it's bearing eggs. She has to produce a lot of smaller lobsters, so it's best to put back into the water.
Lobsters along the South African coast have been known to succumb to low oxygen conditions associated with red tides and may walk out of the water onto the beaches and die. This has been documented periodically since the 1990s, with the last major walkout recorded in March 2022, when it was estimated that 750,000 lobsters walked onto the beach and perished. Collectively, the last decade's walkouts have been in the thousands of tons of lobsters lost to the fishery and to their ecosystem. Such events as these are not well known from other parts of the world, including ours. Back on our eastward journey, we arrive at St. Paul and New Amsterdam Islands that are part of the French Southern and Antarctic lands. The abundance of lobsters here attracted the attention of Western Australian fisherman John Chatterton in the 1980s. He organized a fishing expedition there on the vessel Miss Boomerang, with 2 smaller catcher boats on her deck. They made the 3,500-kilometer trip there from Fremantle, and their catches were phenomenal. The Miss Boomerang was quickly filled with lobsters that were processed and landed in Singapore. The following year, another expedition was undertaken, this time on the aptly named Southern Raider. However, this trip ended badly when the Southern Raider and its crew were apprehended by the French patrol vessel Albatross, and the Raider was sunk at St. Paul. The crew were taken to France's Réunion Island, more than 2,800 kilometers to the northwest of St. Paul. During the crew's detention on Réunion, rumor has it that John Chatterton built a paddleboard and escaped to Madagascar Island, some 400 kilometers to the west. Whether there is any truth to this story is unknown, but it is known that Chatterton and his crew eventually found their way back to Australia. While the fishing expeditions to these remote islands are quite a story of adventure, for the sake of the lobsters, the illegal fishing by the Australians was brought to an end, and today the fishery is managed under strict quotas set by the responsible French authority. So we've seen the other lobster species and where they are found. Now we turn to our lobster's reproductive biology and behavior, and we start by looking at the lobster's external reproductive anatomy, their bits. Females have what are known as gonopores that are found at the base of their third pair of walking legs, through which the eggs are extruded. Females also have a clawed fifth leg, and that is to preen the egg mass during the several months the eggs are incubated under the tail attached to what are known as ovigerous setae. The presence of these long hair-like structures indicates a female's sexual maturity, even when she is not carrying eggs. Males' reproductive openings, also known as gonopores, are at the base of the male's fifth legs, but unlike the females, knowing if a male is mature based on the external features like these is less certain. Regarding mating behavior, it seems that mating is not a haphazard affair. Studies undertaken in New Zealand in a large outdoor tank or mesocosm by a multinational team of scientists indicated that large and small females in mating condition overwhelmingly sheltered in dens that were occupied by large male lobsters. Presumably the females chose dens with a prospective mate. This you can see on the left side of the graph. However, once females were carrying eggs and no longer needed a mate, their selection of dens shifted to a more even distribution between dens occupied by either a large or small male. Even more egg-bearing females chose dens with other females. Very few females chose empty dens regardless of their reproductive status. Following mating and during incubation, a larvae could have somewhere between 40,000 to more than 600,000 brothers and sisters depending on the size of their mother. The fertilized eggs gradually develop and change from a reddish-orange color to brown, and the tiny black eyes of the larvae in the fertile eggs become more conspicuous. Some eggs are infertile and remain opaque and colored like the early stage eggs. Females generally remove the infertile eggs along with the empty egg casings shortly after the brood hatches, so you don't often see these unless you're handling a large number of lobsters at the end of the breeding season. When the eggs finally hatch, the larvae are only a few millimeters in length. After a period of perhaps only minutes, these small larvae, known as naupliosoma, undergo a molt and become a first stage phylosoma. Throughout their pelagic life, the phylosomata go through 10 more stages, progressively growing to as much as 4 centimeters in length at stage 11. Each stage is slightly different anatomically from the previous one. Interestingly, fossil phylosomata from the Upper Jurassic period show that this type of larva has changed little in the past 200 million years, almost as long ago as the earliest dinosaurs. As it turns out, the larval life of the southern rock lobster is among the longest known among marine invertebrates and may last from 9 to 24 months. Although this phase of the lobster's life is comparatively little known, bioceanographic models have been developed to bring together what we do know about the biology of the larvae and the physical oceanographic conditions of their pelagic, or open ocean, habitat. Such models have been used to predict where the larvae may go and how interconnected the lobsters are in southern Australia, and therefore how interconnected Australia's fisheries for this species are. One of the most recent of such models, by PhD graduate Roxana Vasali, suggested that the larvae might drift as much as thousands of kilometers from where they hatch. For example, some of the virtual larvae in her models dispersed from the release sites in the northern zone to a point east of New Zealand, as shown in her figures. However, most of the virtual larvae were dispersed much shorter distances by the end of the 730-day simulation, which is theoretically the limit to their larval life. Where a phyllosoma ends up by the time it can metamorphose into the last larval phase matters to its survival, as we will soon learn. Another very different approach was undertaken utilizing DNA methods to learn about larval dispersal. The research by Cecilia Villacourt-Rath and others suggested that at study sites in South Australia and Tasmania, the resident population was a mix of lobsters from multiple sources, and they termed this chaotic genetic patchiness. The results implied that the larval dispersal must vary through time and that it does not follow predictable pathways. What's all this mean for larval survival, you might ask? The answer may surprise you. Of course, during their long pelagic life, Phyllosomata don't just drift aimlessly along with the currents. We know that they exhibit a behavior where they move deeper in the water column during the day and rise nearer the surface at night. They are not alone in undertaking these vertical migrations, and they form a small part of what is known as the deep scattering layer that first became known when sonars were developed during World War II. Importantly, to survive, they must also find prey on which to feed and avoid predators during this long and dangerous period of their life. Off southern Australia, many species may predate the larvae, including, for example, blue mackerel or even southern bluefin tuna. Like other genera of lobsters in this family, the stage 11 Phyllosoma metamorphoses into a final larval stage known as a purulus. This is the first time larvae resemble lobsters as we generally know them. No one knows for sure what triggers the metamorphosis, nor exactly what cues puruli respond to in choosing where they finally settle into their new habitats. However, there is a suggestion by one study that puruli swim towards reef sounds, while another suggested that there may be chemical cues. Importantly, however, puruli are limited in the distance that they can swim to find a suitable habitat in which to settle. So the many millions or even billions of larvae that never drift back near enough to the coast to make that final swim must be lost to the population. Scientific programs have monitored purulus settlement in New Zealand, Tasmania, Victoria, and South Australia for more than 3 decades. From these studies, we have learned that when puruli settle depends on the location and that it can vary in time of year between places only tens of kilometers apart. Many unanswered questions about settlement remain, including how it varies in intensity from place to place and year to year, as well as how useful it may be in forecasting the abundance of lobsters that will go on to reach legal size, which would potentially be very useful for management. Through tagging studies that marked and released lobsters over most of their range from Tasmania to the head of the Great Australian Bight, and from the shallow inshore reefs to the edge of the continental shelf, and the recaptures of these lobsters in the following months and years, we have learned that they grow slower or faster depending on where they are. Consequently, depending on where you find a lobster that is just legal size, it could be anything from about 5 to more than 10 years old, and at the extreme southwest of Tasmania, females may never reach legal size. The general trend in growth is from slow in southern waters to the highest in the warmest waters, for example, on the west coast of South Australia. However, there are places that defy that trend, for example on the reefs near the mouth of the Murray River. How long a lobster may live depends on many factors, but one of the important ones is how intensively they are fished. But it is likely that the lucky ones could be expected to live for 20 years or more. Larry, the big lobster in Kingston, is more than 40 years old and has not grown a single millimeter in all that time. How fast lobsters grow plays a role in determining at what size females become sexually mature. Many legal-sized females that are caught are still immature in parts of South Australia. However, size limits are set to try and ensure that enough of the population is mature and spawning before they can be caught. There's no doubt that there are many different predators on the reef that lobsters must avoid, and the smaller they are, the more predators there are, and the more dangerous it is. However, as lobsters grow, the number of potential predators diminishes, and the largest lobsters probably have few predators to fear aside from a hungry octopus or one of us. However, each time a lobster molts, regardless of its size, it's at greater risk of predation. In this footage, we see just a few of the potential predators on the reef. Some people have called lobsters the cockroaches of the sea, believing that they eat whatever they happen upon. It is true that lobsters' diets include a wide number of prey items, but these are generally taken alive. The dietary mainstays are shellfish, sea urchins, and other crustaceans. What goes in must come out, so if you have a look at what comes out of your next lobster, you're likely to see what it's been eating, unless it's been held in captivity at a processing facility. It is common to see empty abalone shell near lobsters' dens, and as this footage demonstrates, they are very capable of taking one of these. There are many interesting lobster fisheries around the world, but it's time to turn back to ours in South Australia and the people, past and present. Boondik people in southeastern South Australia called our species kane, and wherever it occurred in southern Australia, it would have been known by many different names among the many different indigenous groups. We can't know for sure when or where our lobsters were first exploited, but we can safely say it was a very long time ago. The recent written history begins with French explorers' first-hand accounts of lobsters caught by Tasmanian Aboriginals at the end of the 18th and early 19th centuries. In 1793, crew aboard the French frigate Research wrote, "Several women plunged into the sea in search of lobsters and other shellfish, and after 10 to 12 minutes the women brought back at least 25 pounds weight of them." In 1802, Baudin, captain of the French expedition vessel Geographe, wrote that they caught more oysters and a type of lobster than the crew could eat, and the lobsters were far superior to those eaten in Europe by reason of the delicacy and lightness of their flesh. Similar written accounts of Aboriginals catching lobsters are not as well recorded in South Australia, but local historian Heather Carthew wrote that her father, Sid Smith, wandered the Canunda Downs with Boondik man Lanky Kana, who told him that during summer fish became the major food on the Boondik menu, and crayfish were prized from under the ledges opposite Lake Bonny at low tide. A man named Panang Harry wrote in the Border Watch 40 to 50 years after the fact that Aboriginals working on Glencoe Station in the state's southeast would have a holiday on the coast during summer when they would fish and return with live lobsters packed in seaweed. Discovering more about Aboriginal use of lobsters is hindered by their fragile exoskeletons that are unknown among the numerous shelled middens that have been studied. Maybe you know something that might help make this part of our story a bit more complete. Aboriginal occupation of southern Australia's coastline predates European contact by at least 30 to 40,000 years, and possibly much longer. So maybe lobster harvesting began here earlier than anywhere else in the world. Lobsters would have been extremely plentiful, and gleaning among the shallow reefs would have produced important catches along much of the southern coastline. The period of Aboriginal occupation also implies that catching lobsters may have started when sea level was as low as 130 meters below where it is today, during the last ice age. If so, Aboriginals may have harvested lobsters at what is today the edge of the continental shelf. 20,000 years ago, if we headed due west from Robe, for example, the coastline would have been about 90 to 110 kilometers west of the present coastline. Over the intervening millennia, sea level rose as the ice caps melted and reached near present-day levels about 5,000 years ago. A Bowendick legend recalled by several local historians describes the formation of MacDonnell Bay, South Australia's largest lobster fishing port. It begins that the land once extended far beyond the present coastline, and that a splendid forest existed there, and notably a wattle tree that produced a delicious gum. It ends with the sea rising to cover this area. Similar legends from the York and Eyre Peninsula regions tell us of the sea rising to form Spencer Gulf and about Kangaroo Island being cut off from the mainland, and numerous similar legends exist in other parts of Australia. Seabed images off the Glenelg River derived from repeated transits of the area by Zeb Johnston and his lobster boat, equipped with bottom mapping technology, shows very clearly the old riverbed when seas were lower than they are today, and supports the Bowendick legend. What more would be revealed about these times if we could explore the seabed in greater detail today? After colonization, South Australia's population of free settlers grew, and one can imagine the demand for seafood with it. The point when fishing activities that eventually evolved into the lobster fishery we see today is, like many historical facts, contentious. One account is that it began in South Australia in the early 1870s as a hoop net fishery, while the first commercial lobster pots are believed to have been used in 1889. One of the pioneers of the fishery was John Paulson, who regularly sailed his cutter Stella from Glenelg to the fishing grounds on Kangaroo Island and around the southern end of the York Peninsula. Fortunately for us, John carefully kept handwritten records of his catches between 1897 and 1907. His son, Nils Swanson, who hailed from American River on Kangaroo Island, explained these records during an interview in the 1970s.
These two chaps came from the Isle of Wight in England, so they were talking things over, and they suggested that they make some lobster pots the same as they use in Cornwall and try and see if they could catch lobsters here. And that's how they started. They started fishing with 9 pots. They used to take the pots in the dinghy close in and set them close in along the rocks, and they'd pick them up at midnight and take the crays out and set them again and pick them up at daylight. So they get 2 pickups in the one night. Oh, here we are. So 5 dozen crays. Well, that would have been when they started. That was the first sign of crays, March the 13th, 1899. No, well, see, there was 4 baskets of snapper in that, and they were 150 pounds, you see, and 5 dozen crays. So you get indication of the price and a bit further over.
Yeah, I was fishing a couple of miles west of the North Reef, which is off Cape Jaffa there. So, and I didn't worry about reefing the sail. I thought, well, she can handle it. So, anyway, the further I came towards shore, the harder the wind blew. By the time I got in near the point, near the Cape, it was probably up around 30 knots or so, and travelling side on, and it just heeled the boat right over till the water was running in at the chain plates and run down the deck and out the stern. But I was laying across the cockpit, leaning right across the cockpit with the tiller across my stomach to hold her. And there, when I got a good grip of her, I shot her into the wind and spilt the wind out, and then peeled her off then for the moorings and went in and tied up. But yeah, she was a fresh day, like fresher than I expected. 21 footer, but she was built out of Jarrah in Oregon, solid. Had a 5-bag well in her, and she drew 4 feet of water. So she was a good sea boat. I could go out there and do my gear on some days when the others wouldn't do it, but I would go because I had that much faith in her, and she was a good sea boat. I'd get a fair bit of water over the deck, don't worry about that. I'd have a job to see out of my eyes by the time I got in with salt.
Let's step back in time and hear from the other fishers who were fishing in the post-war years, a time at which the fishery was expanding from domestic to export markets.
This was one of the days that we had a big catch, but a lot of days we had 14 bags, 15, 16 bags, but this was our best catch we had, and this was over the river, and we only had 40 pots down there, and we pulled, some of the pots twice. There might have been odd ones pulled 3 times, but we never got home till about 8 o'clock that night, and I went to Apex and unloaded. There was a lot of boats come home. They had more pots than us, but they had 14, 15 bags a day too. Roy Williams, he had a fair few pots out at the time, and he had them all in different lines, and you could shoot down the line like the floats was even, like in a straight line. Our pots was all over the place, but old Roy Williams did come home with 14 or 15 bags every day, the same. There was a fair few boats down there at the time, but most of them had big motors, and we didn't have any. We only had 10 horsepower, and it used to take us, 2.5, 3 hours to get home. Some days it took us for 4.5 one day with a nor'wester coming home, and you had to pump her out all the time. Get on the pump. Fishermen here now, I'm talking about now, fishing now, they're going down, way down over the river, but they've got 800 and 1,000 horsepower to go down there. And when they finish their gear, they probably only an hour and a half to get home. In those days, you had a bit of wind on. The old man put the sail up all the bloody time. I used to hate to put the sail up, but he'd get up underneath and go to sleep. for probably 2.5, 3 hours coming home. And I'd down there with a tiller between my legs like this. Spray coming over. He always bought me coats and everything and hats. I used to have cages. Had 14 cages down there. And, you know, some cages would hold about 6 or 8 bags. Some would hold might be 8 or 9 bags or whatever. One cage held 14 bags, that was the big cage. And when they filled them, they couldn't go fishing anymore. And a bloke from the Mount, his name was Bob Little, used to bring him up on the old party phone, 2 longs and a short and a long whatever in those days. And then he'd come down and we'd pull the cage, well, row the cage in with a dinghy and then hook the horse onto a cage and pull it up on the seaweed and then bag out into the bags, and Bob Little used to take them to the Melbourne market. And I'd done that for years.
Well, the boats those days were nothing like they are today. They were mainly what we call cooter boats, built for catching cooter out of Victoria. The one I had, that's what it was. No cabin, mast, a sail, petrol engine, tiller at the back, waterproof clothes. There was none of them. I had an old army greatcoat. No protection. Not like it is today, but in the old Mayflower, the whole fleet, you know, some had better boats than others. There's always that. There was a couple of decked-in boats, but 50% or more would have been open boats. And yeah, get in a rough day, or rough for us then, you'd be on the man in the pumps pretty often. And the pump we had on the old Mayflower was a bore pump off a windmill that lifted a lot of water quick. And you just pulled her up and pumped her. They're all slow, didn't use much fuel. I know in the old Mayflower it's a marvellous thing. The boat was old. We had a petrol engine in it, a Maurice 6-cylinder. We then put a diesel in, a little 4-cylinder Maurice diesel. And the thing that amazes me most is the fuel tank. It was a 12-gallon oil drum strapped up under the side. We'd fish all day, no trouble at all. We had a car diff on its side and the one axle cut off. And I don't know whether the blooming winch top was a couple of plough discs. But it worked. There was boats who caught 20 bags of crays in a day. And when they come to shore every day, that's day fishing, they bring them in from the boat moorings, in the dinghies, but the jetty trolleys, I've seen one boat fill it right up over the trolley coming down the jetty and pushing them, struggling. It'd be a fair weight. And talking about big catches, Fishbrooks, one of the factories in Port MacDonnell at the time, they would start, or any of the factories would start at about 4 p.m, tailing the crays and work until they finish, and it could be 2 o'clock in the morning. But one day, that many came in, the night went through, went all night tailing it. But they still had, Fishbrooks had 100 bags that came up from Carpenter's Rocks. And they hadn't done them. So they took that 100 bags on trucks up to the dump at the lighthouse over the cliff, and they tipped them all back into the water. That was a cost borne by the factory.
I was with my father and his brother in this 27-foot Royal. In those days, I think we had about 22 pots. I think my share was 5, well, I don't know what it was, my share was 5 pots. It's because I was young and so forth, and we'd pull these pots up. I remember on one occasion, out of the 22 pots, we got 18 bags. And out of the 5 pots that I had, I'd be shockingly disappointed if I couldn't get a bag and a half. Shockingly disappointed. And this is only just a few miles off of Beachport. Look, when I look back and think how prolific those crayfish were in those days. I remember on one occasion, a chap who I fished with later, and he'd made a big pot, a biggish pot, bigger than normal, and he'd made it out of cane. You can have that if you want. He said, bloody thing won't catch. And I said, all right, I took it out, and the first day, chock-a-block, bag and a half out of one pot, because it was a big pot. And in those days we did use bigger pots. But look, when I got crayfishing later on in my own vessel, it was virgin ground. Some of that ground had never seen a pot in its life. And you would pull up pots, chock-a-block with crayfish, and it seemed to be just as many hanging on the outside. The new grounds were accidentally found off of Cape Douglas in about 30 fathoms, 26 to 30 fathoms. I had only recently bought the Dolphin, fine 40-foot vessel from the Haldane family. And anyway, I was one that went, there was 3 boats with myself. I was the smallest. And then there was another boat called the Margaret. She was about 54 foot. And then there was an ex-ketch that used to carry wheat around the Gulfs, the South Australian Gulfs, that had been converted to a fishing boat called the Hendry Moss. And anyway, the Margaret was the one that discovered these crayfish, and the owner, family friend, said, Murray, come with me. So we went down, and it was a beautiful day, a perfect flat calm day. We set the pots, and anyway, when we pulled the first one up, I said, we've been given a bum steer here, there's nothing, it's a bloody dud. When it broke to the surface, it was full of the speckled, light-coloured crayfish, absolutely chock-a-block.
Well, I started when I was about 9 or 10 with my old dad and Uncle Peter in a little old cooter boat. And I'd spew 3 times at every pot. And I was always delighted when we was on the way home. And my old dad, he was the second generation Italian, and he'd sit there at the old tiller singing his bloody head off. And yeah, and we had an old rugby engine, go round and round in circles, and big kayak ropes, and we fished 25 fathoms, hand pulled. Then as I got to 14, my brother bought the Dolphin from the Haldanes at Port Fairy, and I left school and went fishing with him. And we fished down the Douglas, down towards Port Mac, for 2 or 3 years, and caught a lot of crows, but 9p a pound. And then finally, that sort of, we came back home to fish off Beachport and Norakrina, and I fished with my brother Maurice for 6 years, and then I bought a boat from Williamstown in Victoria and started fishing on my own. I was just trying to think. So you couldn't borrow money under the loans to producers till you were 21. And my old dad stepped in. I reckon that must have been the first boat I had, the Albatross. The day I was 21, he was at the back door knocking to pay out. I think he was that relieved to pay it off. But yeah, well, we built up a bit of a fund, not much, and the loans to producers, which was a very good scheme under the State Bank, and that's the reason how we become to buy boats. But in latter days, Safco done the guarantee with the State Bank, had a very good relationship with the State Bank of South Australia, and a lot of us were able to get into it. But on our own, no, we had no hope at all. I wanted to get a bigger boat, so I fished with my brother-in-law, and he said, you can skipper the boat, and I put in a week skippering, and then I said, hey, you're going to take this boat over, you better learn all you can. So I went out on the deck, which nearly bloody killed me, but and finally we got, Dad went up the river, and Ron Stewart from Port Fairy was there and agreed to build me a boat. So we finished up with the Coltana, and she served me till I retired at 58. So yes, we had our good years, our bad years, and I was still with my brother, so that had been about 1950. We could go. We came from Norakrina right down past Southend, and bag and a half, 2 bags, bag and a half more than the 2 bags was as good as we could do, and we tried every trick in the book. But if they don't want to jump in that pot, they certainly don't.
The first year I started crying, they were 1 6 a pound, and they went up to 1 9. And then after that, well, that's where she's gone on from there. But still, we still made money, you know. It's of course you could buy it and go up the pub with 1 9 and come home full. Go up there today and you can't get in the door. That's the difference.
When I first started fishing, I was crewing for 2 years, and then what happened, my brother and myself, we thought, oh, well, we'll build a boat and we'll see how we go. So we built a little 17-foot plywood boat. Then we built another one in the early 60s, 25-foot plank boat. We had that for a few years, and then I built Amanda Cay, which is a 42-foot chine boat, and which had that for about 10 years, I suppose. Yeah, the transition from the early boat, the Carvel built round Build's boat, was it was just something we started to do, and then once we had that for a while, we seen this design in a boat book, and we thought we'd have a look at that, because we was, you know, you're trying to get something with a little bit more speed and a little bit more stability, and that's why we went that way. And we went to the 40-foot, 42-foot chine plank boat, which was a really good boat. It was one of the best boats I'd had. You know, you weren't rocking all day, you were steady in the water, and it was really a lot better to work on.
Well, my brother Frank, he was working the mine in Belgium there for 3 or 4 years. And they got a friend in Australia in here, you know, come many years before. He was a good friend, and he said, you know, Frank, I said, you better have a better job in here than work in the mine. And in 1950, come in Australia there, and after that, my brother Bruno around the 52, he come in working in the pine follow there, cut the pine, working the quarry, break a stone or something. 1953, boat, he bought a little boat, you know, and then back then, 25 foot, it was a good sized boat. And in 1955, myself and my brother Mario can become an Australian. Because back home there was plenty work, but no money at all, you know, it was a bit hard to see. The war just finished, you know, and then we decided to come in Australia. I was 19, my brother Mario was only 17. My brother Mario, we got with my brother Frank, and I got with my brother Bruno there. 1955 to 1956 season we started. It was a bit harder back then because we used to lose a lot of pot. And the net in the crayfish pot, the netting was only chook there, netting, and it only lasted for a week. You go out every morning, 10 or 15 pot in the deck because, you know, and then they come on. You set it between the glass of wine, we got to cover them up a few pots, you know, and otherwise, you know, they can't leave the glass of wine behind. And this is the job we used to do day after day after day, and then but it was a good life back at then, you know, and the people was more friendly than now. When we start making a little bit big about it, we start getting a little bit more far away. And the new ground, sometimes you never been fishing before. It was a bit more chance, you know, to catch a few more fish there. And but sometimes we all used to be blind, you know, the water's a bit warm, the cold water or something. You got to blind somebody, I suppose, you know, because the fish was not every year about crawling there, tell the truth, you know. But in the end of it, you know, when it was a very poor season, the price was up a little bit, and they even up a little bit. You know, this is about how it was back then. I fished that boat, it was the best boat in Beachport there. Everybody said, you know, Charlie, you got the best boat in here. I said, you know, well, we've been working hard for this one, mate. And like I said before, you know, 6 people work together, and then it's easy to make something, you know, and then they work it out easy that way.
I was getting 16 pounds per week. And I had a wife and 2 little boys at the time. I wanted to improve on that. So I went and asked, could I have the ganger's job? The ganger left. I asked, could I have the ganger's job? And he said, no, I can't do without a grader driver. And I said, well, you've done without one. My brother-in-law wants me to go fishing with him. So that's how I come down here with Vaughan Chambers. He had 27-foot Irene, the boat he had. And I wasn't really confident at that time because I used to get seasick. I didn't know whether I'd get over it or not, but I did get over it and really, really enjoyed it. Vaughan was a very capable fisherman, but I know he had a fishing licence, and the first one I got, I didn't have to have a fishing licence then, I was only the deckhand. But after a few years I had to get one, and it cost me 10 shillings. A little bit different to what it is these days. He bought a boat from Maurice Corigliano at Beachport, Dolphin, and he had the Irene just sitting in the water. And Bob Dixon wanted to go fishing. He came with us, and he didn't think he'd stay because he was seasick for a month. But he eventually got over it, and Vaughan wanted to get rid of the Irene, and we didn't need 3 on the boat anyway, so I bought the Irene from Vaughan for a magnificent sum of £2,000. We fished once down at Whale Rock, and we filled the well and started filling cray pots. Stayed at camp down there the night. We threw cray pots over the side with something tied on the top to preserve them, but they lobbed in sand. When we pulled them up the next morning, the crays were all dead. And I think we packed about 18 bags out of the boat. When I first started with Vaughan, we had 40 pots just off South End, and if we didn't get 4 bags, he'd shift them. I seemed to think 4 bags was enough, but he was never satisfied. Anything under 4 bags, he'd shift the pots.
We used to have a bloke by the name of MacDonnell. He was an ex rodeo man. He knew all about rodeos, whatever. And he used to cart cattle and stuff around. But he used to kill horses and bring the horses down for bait in pieces. And there was some fishermen here, they'd be there waiting, and when MacDonnell pulled up at Apex with the horses, they'd be in with the wool hooks and they'd grab all the hind legs they could, you know. And they were real gutsers as far as, you know, getting the bait. They wouldn't share with anyone else. They'd just, you know, push you aside to grab the bait. But Tower is over there. That was ours. And the old man used to have about 14 horses in there. And when MacDonnell hadn't come down there, we'd go and kill a horse. And he had a couple of mates. Roy Williams was one, and his crew and all the rest of it. They used to come and, you know, they'd get a horse and skin it, and they'd take it home. The old man would, you know, give them a horse or whatever. But they were good mates.
And then back in them days, they used to just catch the tails and throw the bodies over at the end of the jetty at Robe by the tons and tons, truckloads. And then they invented Safcol. Pioneer at the Southern Kangaroo Island crayfishing grounds was a fella called Fred Harry. But when I interviewed Nils Swanson, I had to ask him, I knew he had a lot of time for Fred and the old man. I said, who was the best fisherman? Didn't bat an eye. Fred Harry, without a doubt. Who was the second best? He said, your old man. I actually took my father fishing with me, if that's possible. Took him a couple of trips. And I didn't take him long enough, that's the bloody trouble. He told me a few stories. He said, I said, how'd you find the lumps, for example, out, you know, out the middle of past young rocks and that sort of carry on. And he said, oh no, you just sit there and look at the wave be a bit higher than the other one. You know, look at when there was a little bit of swell. Then you'd go over and check it out. He never fished much back to the east. He fished young rocks and the western end because he had it to himself.
When I first started fishing with the old man, the corks had gone out, and then the glass floats came in. We were making nets to put the glass floats in to tie them on the lines. But we had the winches we had, and sometimes we had the iron rollers on the side of the boat where the pot came over. And I remember one summer we smashed 5 dozen. See, for a long time we were still using sisal rope, which is a natural fibre, and of course that sinks. And the strong tides off the back of the reefs out there, they used to pull the lines down and then they'd take the floats and all. And prior to that, they used to use Kaiar lines. They're like coconut fibre, the old lines. And then it went into the sisal rope. I've still got sisal rope in the shed there. At the end of the summer, they had those lines, we used to just take a heap of wheat bags out, we just cut the floats off and chuck the rope over the side. It'd just rot out down there, and probably a couple of months there'd be nothing left of it. But my father used to say to me, he said, you know, he said, we should get a big boat. He said, there's a lot of crays way out there in the deep water. Because during the war, he wasn't allowed to crayfish. There was only 3 fishermen left here, the others had gone off to the war. And the director of fisheries come down and he said, none of you blokes have got allowed to the war. He said, you've got to catch sharks. He said, we need the shark livers for cod liver oil. So they did that for 5 years. That's all they did was fish for sharks. And of course they used to go all the way out there in the deep water. They'd sail at Curlew. Sometimes Dad said they'd sail nearly all night and get way off there towards the shelf and drop the shark lines. And the thing was, they pulled them by hand too, there was no winch. And pulled them back up by hand. And he said sometimes you get half a bag or 2/3 of a bag of crays off the shark hooks on the bottom. He said they're thick down there.
So my grandfather was working on the family farm and had an accident with a hay press, lost his finger. So the doctors told him that he had to keep his fingers moving or his hand would seize up. So because he had a brother-in-law and that was involved in fishing, he went fishing. As far as I can gather, it was in the late 30s, maybe around 1940 in that period. His first boat was about a 13-foot dinghy, basically rowboat. My grandfather built him when he was 14. He went rowing that around and fishing, and then at 16 he bought about a 22-foot timber, just a cutter, like with a mast and a tiller and an unreliable engine. So sails were very important. You know, when you sit back and think about what our fathers and grandfathers and that went through to earn a living, you've got to take your hat off to them, I think. Well, as I said, some of the ports are straightforward. Blackfellas Caves and Carpenter's Rocks, Port MacDonnell even, they're a little bit more challenging than most of them. Yeah, and when we just had the conventional hulls that did about 7 knots, you know, you'd have to, here at the caves, we'd have to quite often turn around, face up to a wave that you thought might break or didn't look very good, and you'd face up to them, maybe sit there for 10 minutes or more till you thought that it was a good enough opportunity to come in, and sometimes you misjudged it, and yeah, it was fun at times, yes.
And my father moved to Kingston originally with Telecom or Telstra, and I guess fishing was in his blood, and he decided to have a go at crayfishing, and that's what he ended up doing until he passed away. 1948 we came to Kingston. Yes, well back then there were a lot of older fishermen and they didn't have a very good reputation, the fishers, because some of the fishermen lived at Cape Jaffa in shacks and things, so a lot of drinking and a lot of hoo-ha went on.
Well, our grandfather had mainly his 3 sons, Fred, Jack and Bob. They started all this together. As far as I can work out, about 1945, 46 is when they started here. They used to do a bit of fishing around where Gregory is there now. They used to be in that Adeline there. Then they come around here and built a couple of little, like, used to have a factory, not that one, but one before. But that burnt down in 1956. There was other people doing a little bit at that stage. Only had little boats and no cabins or. Yeah, no, we weren't the first ones to fish out of here. There used to be a fella, used to live just over there where Marty's. Percy Fish, Wilson Brothers. Quite a few old, you know, they probably only had 10 pots or something like that. Started off with the, in a dinghy, then they bought the Dauntless, which was actually built as a yacht. They brought it back from Adelaide and took a week to get from Adelaide to here, and then made it into a cray boat. And I've seen it myself on that boat with 10 bags of crays in the well and 100 sharks on the deck. And she was over like this. I think we had 10 licences in Victoria, because in them days you could use the same licence number on South Australia.
I think we leased 5 boats over there. Was it the Islander, the Nilipa? Some bastard stole it. She wasn't a bad old boat. And they were building boats all summer and winter, and in the winter time we go down to help. The Karen Margaret, Dad and his brothers built it in the shop where 80 is. You wouldn't think a boat fitting there, would you? We had a little share in, don't know whether you heard of them, Fishbrook, Fisherman and Alan Brooksby. That's what it's called, Fishbrook. But then, you know, price of crayfish wasn't enough. So you look at doing other things, like the tail market wasn't much better than if you could sell them. I remember when we were kids, you used to take the crow, put it on the back of a truck, bags of crows, take them to Melbourne. And we used to keep them in crates out here and the sea would get rough and there'd be crates on the beach. But the lobsters didn't die. I don't know, they're all full of sand, but they didn't die. And yeah, when the tail America come on board, it still wasn't a good price, but it was better than what. So we built that factory in about 3 stages. First of all, when we opened the factory, we cooked nearly all of them, and they went to France. But then the French, they're real fussy buggers. And if you had any broken legs or feelers, they didn't want them. Well, say we had sheep and cows and pigs and geese as well. We had 20 odd boats, and that's 40 people. So you just keep building houses and that. So you can have your own people. You know, usually if you wanted a job, you had to have somewhere for them to live. Because most of them in them days didn't have a motor car, didn't have a very high wage, or so you give them a house, somewhere to live and a job, and that's how we kept them up. A lot of them in the early days, oh yeah, most of them were with us for 20 years or more.